Well, I'd go by base ops and pick up my orders, and there'd be an envelope that says, do not open till you get a certain place, a certain altitude, and then it'll tell you that you're going to go on this route to Russia and drop your bomb, or it would say this is a practice mission and tell you where you're going. So you never knew when you were called, and you never knew when you first got on your plane where you were going or when you were going. We understood you'd be wiping out 500,000 people. You hoped it was just practice. But you knew you were trained to do a job, and you would do it.
It was a half-century-long conflict between the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies for global domination. Fought through propaganda, espionage, massive weapons proliferation, including nuclear, and wars on the periphery, which in the Cold War terms were third world conflicts. Places such as Algeria, Guatemala, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, etc., etc. What it wasn't is it wasn't a hot war. It was called a Cold War because it was primarily the two main participants, the United States and the Soviet Union, never directly fought.
There were a lot of jokes about the possibility of war and about the Cold War. For example, one of them was, what do you do if there is a nuclear attack? You're supposed to wrap in a white sheet and start crawling towards the cemetery. Or, for example, the other one, will there be World War III? No, but the fight for peace will be so fierce that nothing will be left at the end. So I guess laughter is a good way to deal with situations that you really cannot control.
There is only world peace where there is power to preserve order among nations. And the retaliatory power of the Strategic Air Command of the United States Air Force is the greatest deterrent to general war there is in the world today. Its nuclear-armed bombers and missiles stand ready to counterattack any aggressor unwise enough to start a general war among the nations of our world.
When I was at Kansas State, it was a land-grant college, and all land-grant colleges, the males had to take ROTC. Then after 2 years, I decided I might like a military career, and I went ahead and took the advanced 2 years. I went through one line and got my graduation diploma, went to another line and got my second lieutenant bars pinned on me, and of which my future wife, Carolyn, pinned them on me. And then later that day, I asked her to marry me. So, excuse me, that was a big day.
I assembled my ideas of the United States from the books I read. My favorite were White Fang and Martin Eden by Jack London, The Last of the Mohican by James Fenimore Cooper, and of course Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. And of course everybody was fascinated with the stories of Wild West. My father also read a lot, and he believed Americans were very courageous, brave, and adventurous. Oh, there was the talk that United States want to start a nuclear war, and of course the Soviet Union was fighting for peace. Occasionally, I would see a caricature in the newspaper depicting an American with a bomb. You know, at least in my surrounding, nobody paid much attention to that. Who believes government anyway?
Half of the combat-ready bombers and tankers are poised for takeoff within minutes. In addition, some are always airborne along special routes, ready for orders that would send them to their target.
Strategic Air Command was during the Cold War, and that was the first plane of the Cold War that they used. It was the first jet bomber the United States had. And at that time, when I was flying, it could fly higher and faster than any jet plane in the world. You had your two pilots up on top on the bubble and your navigator bombardier down in the nose. So you just had a three-man crew on a plane that has 6 engines and a plane that's carrying a nuclear bomb.
The Soviet Union primarily relied on submarines and, of course, land-based missiles. They never had flying around 24/7. That was the one thing the Soviet Union, from the end of World War II till the end of the Cold War, never invested heavily in strategic bombers. The United States always had a massive superiority in that.
I had to go to bomb commander school, which was a study of the atomic bomb. I had to not only study it and understand it, I had to be able to crawl back down the crawlway and arm or disarm it manually in case something would happen. The bomb had your uranium in a lead ball in the center of the bomb. Around that had TNT. So what happens when you drop that and that bomb hits, the TNT squeezes that uranium ball and lets loose the elements that cause the nuclear explosion.
Nuclear attack was ever present from 1949 to the end of the Cold War, which is the early 90s. Once the Soviet Union got the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb, there was always a possibility that they would use it, and of course they always thought there was a possibility we could use it.
I remember that once a year it was a mandatory day of civil defense. And on that day, upon hearing the bell, students, teachers, staff were supposed to run out from the school building, gather on the lawn, and put on masks made of cheesecloth. Those masks everybody had to make at home, and all of that was supposed to be done in 10 minutes.
The only thing I know about there or heard them talk about is, which is kind of silly, but I've heard they would, some schools and things, they'd have them get under their desk. I don't know what good that'd do against the nuclear bomb, but anyway.
Here they are on their way to school on a beautiful spring day. But no matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know what to do. Paul covered the back of his head so that he wouldn't be burned, and Patty covered herself with the coat she was carrying. They knew how to duck and cover. They acted right away when the flash came.
Our crew of 3, they dropped us off in the 10,000-foot level of the Sierra Nevada mountains in February, and we had to learn to survive. What we had to learn to do was to make snares to catch rabbits or whatever we could. We'd take our parachutes and wrap around our framework that we built, and then in the center, you would dig out a part down through the pine needles and everything. We'd put rocks around it where you could build a fire. They always had somebody in the area in case there'd be a problem. And so every day or two we'd see somebody. They wouldn't stop saying anything, but we'd see somebody was keeping track of us. When we got to the end, here were guys in Korean uniforms speaking Korean language with submachine guns and grabbed us and threw us in a truck and hauled us off, and they took us to a concentration camp, which we had no clue this was coming. We had to sleep in a cave, no straw, no bedding, and every day, all day long, basically, they would feed you with propaganda on the loudspeaker system. And then they would take you one by one down to see the Korean commandant. Well, when you get in there, then they start questioning you. And of course, you're taught all we can say is our name and our serial number. They would do things like make you kneel on a broomstick. And then they'd put you in a black box. And this box would not be tall enough where you could stand up. It would not be wide enough where you could sit down. Ever so many minutes, somebody come along, bam, 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 on the box. And you put up with that for a few hours. Next day, they took you down there and they threw you in a black hole. Things like that. Mainly, they say to show you what would be coming if you were captured, and they wanted you to be prepared to know how to handle it. For breakfast, you got a cup of coffee. And for the other meal during the day, you got a cup of soup, which they scooped out of garbage cans, and a half-piece bread. And that was it while we were in that concentration camp. When I got back, I had lost, like dirt to all this, about 18 pounds. and I was in good condition back in those days, too.
The day-to-day operations, both in the United States and the Soviet Union, they're fairly unaware. I mean, obviously there's a great deal of secrecy, not just with military operations, but with nuclear weapons. Some countries that even have them don't admit they have them, or they don't admit they have them. What human nature is you really don't face the gravity of a situation until it's square in your face. If you had to live your life every day, and every day you were shown or faced with this prospect of a nuclear holocaust, you would be much more different than if you went to work every day and you knew nothing about it.
I saw military twice a year during the 1st of May parade and during the Victory Day, which is May 9th parade. Other than that, there was no military personnel or equipment presence.
As a B-47 pilot, you had to have a top secret clearance. So I got a top secret clearance, and I would go in with my crew, and we'd go into that compound. And we are the only ones, we had our key to the lockbox that we used, and we were the only ones that had a key to that. We'd open the lockbox and pull it out. And then that box would have our targets in Russia, where we were going in, how we went, what our route was, and even had such things as if you were shot down, who you contacted to get back out of Russia or back out of Ukraine or wherever our targets were. And so that was all there, and you couldn't take that with you. You had to memorize it all. It also had a Russian language book, and you had to memorize what you could of that.
General, this is Senior Controller. You're wanted on Mobile.
The SAC commander has the same immediate contact with all his forces through the SAC communication system. We shall see how this network can swing SAC's armada into action within seconds and control it.
Oh, about every month or something like that, they'd have what they call an alert. And the alert was to be handled just like we were on an alert for Russia, because that was our target. The hard part about that is I was married at that time, and that's pretty hard on a family, because you didn't know and she didn't know. Now, a typical practice mission for Russia was we would take off at Lake Charles, go down over the Gulf, and then over the Gulf I would get connected with a KC-97, which would refuel the airplane. You never took off with a full fuel because you'd have to have too much runway. And we'd start north. And when we get around Bryan, Texas, there was an Air Force base there, and they would scramble on us. They always had to come in from behind us because we flew so high and so fast that we didn't have a fighter at that time could attack us from the side or front. And as we went north, they'd scramble on us again right at North Dakota. And then my orders would say, turn and take a bomb run on Chicago. When we released, of course we didn't actually release the bomb, but they could grade us on how accurate it was. And then we'd leave there and we'd head on back to Lake Charles. All in all, we were usually up 11 or 12 hours at one time. That's a long time to sit in that little seat.
It would obviously be something that the average person could not ever fathom until you were sitting there. It would humble. It would create a level of professionalism, possibly anxiety. They would take their job much more serious than someone who did not have at his fingertip or at the joystick or at any other technical device that would allow you to launch or destroy hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people.
When you did get an alert, you did have the actual bomb, which a lot of people don't realize that. We were flying around with those bombs. And all I had to do was reach down their little red switch. If you haven't got it armed, it's not going to do any more than maybe the TNT. You might have what you call a blockbuster then, where it blows up maybe a block or something like that. There's no problem as long as you haven't armed it. And of course we were forbidden to arm it. Even if we had been a real circumstance, we would not have been allowed to arm the bomb until we got out of the United States. It's not a job for guys who got a wife or kids, because it's too much pressure on them. I mean, every time they call an alert, is it true or is it a practice? And there's no way you knew. I didn't even know till I got in there and got my orders and got up to a certain place where they told me I could open the orders. So it was a very tense time on military personnel in SAC. Thank goodness everyone I had said this is a practice mission.
Because of this command and control system with its communications facilities, the SAC force can be positively controlled to help us, to deter potential attackers, to prevail if we have to fight, and to be confident that World War III can't be triggered by unauthorized launching of a nuclear bomb.
The United States citizenry, for most of the Cold War, particularly the second half, had a pretty good idea of the level of nuclear weapons we had, or a guesstimate, as well as what the Soviet Union had as well. I would probably think that the Soviet citizen was much more in the dark because of the controlled society, the lack of a free media. But you see in the United States, as early as the 1960s, you have a burgeoning anti-nuke movement, not just the testing of them, but you start seeing the freeze movement, then you see the elimination movement. So the average American citizen knew that we had nukes, knew obviously we were the only country to use one in anger during World War II, and then also the level of nukes we had, and then of course you've got the enormous amount of literature and interest groups and activists and propaganda out there that painted the picture of what would happen, everything from Dr. Strangelove to the day after. So the American citizen, I say the average American citizen probably knew much more, whether it was based in fact or not, knew much more, had an opinion about nukes and the use of nukes and its country's nuclear policy than the average Soviet citizen because of just the level of political system that we live in.
I came in 1991, so right when it was all happening. However, the changes were noticeable starting from the middle of the 80s when Gorbachev started his reforms, perestroika, reconstruction, and openness. And we just all hoped that the life will become less tense.
You just learn to follow orders is what you do. You just kind of don't worry about all the different things. It's your job. It's kind of like when I first went into boot camp. They said you only need to have 3 answers to everything. Yes, sir, no, sir, and no excuse, sir. And that'll cover it.
An individual at that time, there was a level of professionalism that would not allow them to get too sentimental. But as we all know with human beings, once you're further away from it and you get older and you have a much different view of life in general, you know, an 80-year-old man, a 70-year-old man, a 60-year-old man has a much different view of humankind and life in general than a 20, 25-year-old, that you'd have a much different view, probably have much more sentimentality as you get older than you would when you're in the heat of the moment.
My primary target was Ukraine. And here come along years later, I'm in the same area, Donetsk, and I'm teaching people how to teach their kids principles. That's a kind of odd, but because I came back years later and was teaching them about Christianity, very same ones that I would have eliminated.
I taught English for years by then. English language, English and American literature, translation, and I always try to instill in my students love and appreciation for the language and for the culture both of England, Great Britain, and the United States. I find it ironic that in the middle of the Cold War I was teaching English in Kiev, Ukraine, and now I'm here in Oklahoma teaching Russian when the ghosts of the Cold War seem to come back to life, and of course it saddens me.
The one benefit of the Cold War that we've now lost is there's no stability. You know, for all the specter of a nuclear holocaust, the United States and the Soviet Union were the ringmasters, and they could keep everybody into check. Well, the one thing we've learned now since the end of the Cold War is how unstable the world is. And I'm not talking about with having one superpower and having no superpower. I'm talking about with the level of the superpowers controlling the rest of the world.
As I look at it, I'm worried about my kids and grandkids and great-grandkids because things don't seem to be getting better. And we seem to have tensions all over the world right now. And so I'm getting old enough, I'm not going to have to worry about it much longer.
I think the world and the people of both countries would benefit much more from the cooperation between these two countries rather than from a confrontation. The United States and Russia, Soviet Union, Russia, worked successfully in space exploration. We fought fascism together, and that cannot be forgotten. In 1958, the first inaugural musical contest named after Tchaikovsky was held in Moscow. Most of the judges were either from the Soviet Union or from the Eastern Bloc countries. And yet the first prize, the winner of the piano section, was a young man from Texas, Van Cliburn. And proving that art and decency can and should be above politics. And I hope that wisdom and goodwill and the spirit of mutual respect and cooperation will prevail. People don't want to see destroyed cities wherever it is. They don't want to see faces of crying children in refugees camps and lines. People want to live their lives, to raise families, to be happy. Life is so short after all.